Hello everyone, hello and welcome to the penultimate lecture of the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur, and in this week we have been talking about various aspects of cognitive development. Now I have talked about in this week already about biological factors that are responsible for human development, emotional development, motor development. We've talked at length about cognitive development. We've also talked in some sense about slightly complicated processes like theory of mind and development of moral judgment, etc. Now, in this penultimate lecture of the week, I actually wanted to take one of the aspects of cognitive development separately and talk about it in terms of how it develops across the lifetime of an individual. The approach that I will be using to talk today is referred to as the lifespan development of memory. So, I'll be talking about this lifespan approach to development, which argues that developmental changes continue beyond the young adulthood and people keep changing and adapting through their entire lives. Now, the lifespan approach to development can be contrasted with typical notions about development, where it is believed that the entire physical and cognitive maturation of the individual kind of culminates and reaches its peak around the young adulthood time, and there are not major or significant changes that are going to come after that age onwards. In contrast, the lifespan approach to development of any aspect of human development, and we are talking about memory today, is the fact that you track the changes that happen with respect to the particular ability that you are trying to work with, and see how it changes across the lifetime of an individual. For example, we will talk today about how memory develops, how the skills about memory develop from very young children, from 3 days to few months old children, to senile population, to elderly people, 60, 70, 75-year-old individuals, and we will see what changes come in this component of memory. How do people adjust to the coming changes? What are the strategies they use to remember stuff, and how do they organize information? What are the other skills that might help people to really kind of keep track of their memory abilities? Let us move slightly further. So, earlier it was believed, and psychologists believe, that infants around 4 months of age could not remember much, could not remember anything for more than a very brief period of time. Now, this finding could also be a result of the kind of testing methods that were available then, because more recently developmental psychologists have come up with new ways to test the infant's ability to memorize people and object, and they have basically opined for the fact that around 6-month-old infants can actually create association between objects even though they have not really seen those objects presented before together at the same time. So, there are cases being made, the research is suggesting that cognitive psychologists might have underestimated the level of skill that children would have with respect to memory at the given age. So, let us kind of move slightly further from there. When you talk about memory, when you talk about, say for example, what are the things that the child would need, how would the child attend to learning and acquiring new information. So, attention patterns basically is a very important component. So, the thing that the child pays attention to, if you remember, I was talking to you about this a little bit when we were discussing about language acquisition. The child has to pay a lot of attention to whatever speech stimuli are going around the child, whatever intonations are being used, with what kind of emotional expression somebody is speaking whatever sentence, and what the child is doing is the child is paying attention to all of these signals, even though he is not really understanding it in one sense of the word. But the fact is that the child is a very attentive listener, and the child is processing all of this information. Similarly, this attention that the child is applying to his or her environment, to whatever is being said or done around the child, is very important for the child to basically acquire or learn new material. And it is in that sense a very important aspect, a very important ability that could contribute to say for example children's memory. Researchers have nowadays can measure infants' memory by noticing how long they spend paying attention to particular stimuli. That can be one of the ways. If you remember, we were talking about habituation and dishabituation when we were talking about language acquisition. So, if the child is getting familiar, if the child recognizes particular things, then the child will not need to pay a lot of attention to that same thing again and again. So, this is one of the ways that researchers who work with very young children, infants for that matter, use to infer whether the child has acquired or remembered something or not. A very good demonstration of this one could be actually seen in Sangrigoli and Dishkonin's study, where they wanted to test children for the own race bias. Now, own race bias in memory is basically, it refers to the tendency of people to recognize members of the same ethnic group more accurately in comparison to members of other ethnic groups. So, Caucasian children are given a task to remember Caucasian faces, to memorize Caucasian faces versus to memorize say for example African American faces, then you would see that generally these children would probably recognize faces. White children, Caucasian children would recognize faces of Caucasian people slightly better than they would recognize the features of the African American people. Now, it is just an example. The study in question here basically compared 3-month-old white babies, Caucasian babies, and they showed them pictures of white women and Asian women. And the idea was they would present these pictures to the child repeatedly again and again till the amount of time that the child looked at the picture for reduces to almost half. This logic basically says that because now the child has memorized and the child knows that this is a familiar face, the child really does not want to spend much time on that. Okay, children are in some sense slightly miserly about how they going to use their resources. Now, in this study, researchers presented a pair of photos side by side. There was one familiar photo and a photo of an unfamiliar woman from the same racial category. So, some testing was done, they were familiarized with some photos, and then a familiar photo and an unfamiliar photo from either the same racial category or a different racial category could be presented. The results showed that babies who had initially seen a white woman and had gotten familiarized later looked longer at the unfamiliar white woman than at the familiar white woman. So, the idea is because they had been familiarized with this thing, they are not really going to take spend a lot of time looking at these pictures, they are going to look slightly longer at the unfamiliar white women. These data indicate that the babies could certainly tell the difference between familiar and unfamiliar white faces. Further, babies who had initially seen an Asian woman, remember we are talking about white babies, babies who had seen initially an Asian woman later looked equally at the familiar Asian woman and the unfamiliar Asian woman. Why is this happening? Because they are probably not being able to memorize the features of the Asian face as well as they were able to memorize the features of the white American face. So, that is basically the demonstration of that, the fact that own race bias exists, but it actually is more of more of a demonstration about that babies even at around 3 months of age can start remembering faces. Let us talk about a different kind of memory again when we are talking about infants. So, recognizing mother. Research on visual recognition shows that even 3-day-old infants can distinguish their mother's face from a stranger's face. That is something slightly remarkable. Also, infants' ability to recognize their mother's voice especially remarkable. Zalewski and colleagues in 2003, they tested infants about 1 or 2 weeks even before they were born. So, in the last couple of weeks of the pregnancy, and they observed that the infant's heart rate changed more when hearing the mother's voice than when hearing an unfamiliar stranger's voice. So, already you can see even before the child is born, the child has acquired a degree of familiarity with the mother's voice as compared to the voice of somebody else. Now, there is this very interesting technique that people have used to kind of check whether children have memorized something or not. So, this one is referred to as the conjugate reinforcement technique. Now, in the conjugate reinforcement technique, what happens is that there is a mobile that hangs over an infant's crib, and there is a ribbon that connects the infant's ankle and the mobile stand. So, the idea is whenever the infant is going to move his or her feet, the mobile is basically going to move, there is going to be motion. Now, after several minutes after this training is done, after several minutes, 2 to 6 month old infants, they start to kick rapidly and pump up the movement of the mobile, and then lie quietly and watch parts of the mobile move. Now, I am not really referring to a mobile phone here, I am referring to something that kind of moves over the cribs, over the infant's crib. Now, so after several minutes, 2 to 6 months old infants can begin to learn the fact, they can begin to appreciate the fact that as soon as they kick, the mobile starts to rotate. So, they will kick for a time, once the movement is initiated, they will kind of lay back and watch its movement, and that is a very interesting play idea as well. Now, they use this technique of conjugate reinforcement to assess the infant's memory. Now, what they do is they do all of the initial training and testing at the baby's home in the baby's own crib, so that none of the reactions that the baby is going to make are basically because they are unfamiliar with the surroundings. Initially, what they do is they give a 3-minute period at the beginning of the first session. The researcher kind of already takes a baseline measure, how much that how many movements or how many kicks the child is making anyways. During this time, the ribbon is connected from the infant's ankle to an empty mobile stand. So, there is just the stand, there is nothing that is going to move and attract the child's attention. Thus, the experimenter can now measure the amount of spontaneous kicks, how much ever the child is kicking, and they just note it down as a comparison to be made later. Now, the experiment moves the ribbons. The next thing that this one does is that they can kind of measure the amount of spontaneous kicking, and then they basically before the infant starts to move the mobile. Later, what they do is they move the ribbon so that it runs from the baby's ankle to the stand in which now the mobile is hung. So, they kind of connect these two things. The babies are allowed around 9 minutes to discover that when they kick, it activates the movement of the mobile, and this is basically referred to as the acquisition phase. So, now the babies learnt the fact that when I will kick, the ribbon will actually let the mobile move. The infants basically receive these 2 training sessions typically around 24 hours apart from each other. At the end of the second session, the ribbon is unhooked and returned to the empty stand for 3 minutes. Now, again the mobile is moved and the ribbon is tied to the empty stand in order to measure whether the infants remember that they have to make this movement, make this kicking movement to start the revolution. Researchers then measure long-term memory after 1 to 42 days have elapsed. After the elapsed time, the mobile is hung again above the infant's crib with the ribbon hooked to the empty stand. So, that is done. If the infant recognizes the mobile and recalls how kicking had produced movement, then he or she would soon produce that foot kick response to make the mobile turn. Rovi Collier, who actually was doing this research, devised the innovative way to check whether infants actually remembered how to activate the mobile. She also devised an objective method for assessing the long-term memory, as she could now compare 2 measures. They were taking 2 measurements. First was the number of kicks produced in the retention tests without the time being elapsed, and the number of kicks after particular time has elapsed. So, they have 2 tests available. They later also devised a second operant conditioning task, which is more appealing to infants slightly older, 6 to 18 months old infants. And in this task, what was happening was the infants had to learn to press a particular lever so that a train, a toy train could move around a circular track. Now, they had these 2 tasks and they could compare the findings from these 2 tasks to trace infant memory from as early as 2 months to as late as 18 months of age. You can see here, if you compare the mobile task and the train task, you can see that 2 to 6 month old infants already kick to activate a mobile, and 6 to 18 month old infants, they press a lever to activate it. You can see that the amount of retention that is around the age of 6 months, they could already retain this idea of kicking to produce the mobile movement for around up to 2 weeks. Okay. Then you see that as the age in months increases, the amount of retention goes from starting from 2 weeks to up to 13 weeks in the train task. So, this basically says the memory the memory of the child in doing particular things is increasing, and the amount of retention is increasing over time, and it is almost a steady and linear improve during the first 18 months of life. Further, Rovi Collier and colleagues demonstrated that infants and adults' memories has quite a number of similarities. For example, Infants also remembered better with distributed practice. You give a person, an adult, 18-year, 20-year, 25-year-old person, you give them a list to remember and ask them that you memorize this directly, all of this much in just this little time, and come back and I'll take a test. You will see that they perform rather poorly. But if you give them some material and you ask them to study it in separate batches, you study this for 1 hour, take rest, then study this another material for 1 hour, take rest, then study another material for 1 hour and take rest, then if you take the test of recall, you will find that they have done better. Infants also basically work like that. They also remember better with distributed practice. It's not really a great idea to make them learn everything at one go. Infants show as well as adults the levels of processing effect. If you remember Craig and Tulving, and I've talked about this in the course on in the last course, basic cognitive processes, when we've talked about memory in much detail, that in infants also there is better recall for items that are processed at a deeper level. Just to remind you, a shallower level is basically when you're just looking at the physical structure, say for example the sound and the number, etc. The deeper level is when the infant or when the child is started appreciating the meaning, started appreciating how to use that information. That's a deeper level. So if they process something to a deeper level, they learn to use something, they learn a skill, for example the kicking or the pressing lever thing, they will remember it much better as compared to if it is just information about how a sound is like and those kind of things. Now let's talk about memory in children. We've kind of moved slightly away from infants. Let's talk about slightly older children. And memory is basically at least two major components: working memory, different components therein, and long-term memory. Now let's talk a little about working memory. Memory spans basically improve dramatically during childhood. According to research evidence, a 2-year-old can recall about an average of 2 numbers in a row, whereas 9-year-olds can already recall around 6 numbers in a row. So you think that the span of memory is increasing with age. Children with high scores on phonological working memory, a component of working memory, are likely to excel in reading, writing and listening, language related tasks, whereas children who have a higher score on visuospatial working memory, the manipulation of information, shapes and figures, etc., they are much likelier to excel in mathematics. So you can see the relative contribution of the kinds of skills that the children will be good at and might lead to them being good in particular aspects of their studies. When you talk about long-term memory, children typically have excellent recognition memory, but they have a rather poor recall memory. In a test of recognition, researchers presented 2 and 4-year children with around 18 objects, and they later presented a mix of 18 older objects that they had already presented and 18 newer objects. What they find is that 2-year-olds recognize an impressive 80% of the items, whereas 4-year-olds recognized about 90% of the items. So you see, again there is this increase in recall with age. In another study, Myers and Perlmutter, they tested different groups of children for their ability to recall a set of 9 objects. The 2-year-olds recalled only about 20% of the items, of the 20% of the 9 objects, whereas the 4-year-olds recalled around 40% of the 9 objects. So you see, it's almost linear with age. Now, a very important aspect of memory performance, or even our memory performance or children's memory performance in general, is what are the strategies you are using to learn particular material. That's a very, very important aspect. So memory strategies in that sense are very crucial to somebody's memory performance eventually. Memory strategies, just to define it for you, are intentional goal oriented activities that we use to improve our memory. Suppose for example children and even adults for that matter, they learn information with the goal of using it somewhere. For children it is performance in school tests, classes, etc. For adults it might be to use somewhere, to use it as an argument, to use it to do something. Now, young children do not always realize that strategies can be useful. They do not appreciate the use and the kinds of strategies that might be available to them to learn particular material better. Some children may not use these strategies effectively, and this is a big problem. This is referred to as the problem of utilization deficiency. They are not really bad at their memory is not really bad, but they are not either aware of the strategies that can be used. Also, they are not really using those strategies effectively and consistently. Older children, however, typically realize that strategies are very useful. In addition, they choose their strategies more carefully and use them consistently. You can kind of link it with their school performance. The school is getting tougher, expectations to learn information is there, there is this pressure to retain as much as possible. Children already start figuring out ways of remembering and retaining information, and in that process they start using strategies, start hit and trial, use this strategy, use that strategy, and then plan carefully that okay, this one works best for me or this one works best for me. Older children also often use a variety of strategies, so they can kind of, as I was saying, they kind of choose between the number of strategies available to them. Now, the amount of information that you will remember also depends upon the kind of rehearsal that you are going to engage in. So, researchers suggest that 4 to 5 year olds do not really spontaneously rehearse material they want to remember. So, they do not really have this this idea of strategy. However, 7-year-olds they do use rehearsal strategies. By the time they are 5, 6, 7 years old, they do use strategies, and they often silently rehearse several words. By 7-year-old, you might at least be required to start remembering nursery rhymes and those kind of things, and this is where you will see that children are kind of repeating things, mumbling them in their mouth so that they can recall this kind of information. Young children often benefit with the rehearsal strategies, even though they do not use these strategies spontaneously. They have to be instructed, they have to be helped to start using these strategies, but once they start using these strategies, they do benefit from these strategies. There could be organizational strategies as well that might help the memory performance of individuals. Morley and colleagues in 1969, they demonstrated in a study in which children studied, they looked at pictures from 4 categories: animals, clothing items, furniture and vehicles. During the 2-minute study period, they were told that they could organize and rearrange these pictures in whichever way they wanted. This arrangement could actually help them recall stuff better. If you remember, in the memory chapter, we talked about that if you start classifying things in categories, you might be able to retain them better. But young children could rarely move the pictures next to each other, they could not bring similar pictures together. Older children, however, appreciated the rule, and they frequently organized the pictures into these different categories. Talking about imagery, sometimes imagery is a good way to retain information. If you remember how people would memorize cognitive maps, or general, how people would recognize paths or routes or layouts of places, use of imagery is very helpful for retaining information in memory. However, it's seen that it's not really, research evidence does not suggest that people use it so liberally. Spontaneous use of imagery does not even develop until adolescence, even though even most college students, they do not really use imagery as a strategy often enough to remember information. So, all in all, as children develop, they learn to use a variety of memory strategies in a more careful and consistent fashion, and that already reflects in their memory performance. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about some applied aspects of children's memory. So, eyewitness testimony. Researchers have implied that older children provide much more accurate eyewitness testimony than younger children. Also, research confirms that the accuracy of younger children's eyewitness testimony is often influenced by the child's age, stereotyping and misleading suggestions. Now, we have talked a little bit about children's memory, aspects of children's memory. Now, let us move to the memory aspect of elderly people. This is the lifespan development approach that we are following. So, I have kind of already given you a brief survey of what kind of memory abilities are there in children. Let us now survey briefly what are the memory abilities of elderly people. Stereotypes about elderly people often refer to them as being typically forgetful and also cognitively incompetent at times. Research on age-related changes in memory point to a picture that suggests larger individual differences and complex developmental trends in various components of memory. So, the picture is not really clear. You cannot really definitively say that there is a significant decline in adults' memory, in elderly people's memory, unless they are suffering from a disease like Alzheimer's or dementia or those kind of things. People who are developing normally and they have no diseases and they have a significant degree of education, research has shown that it does not really impact their memory so much. Let us talk about working memory. Research indicates that there are age similarities in performance on tasks that are relatively straightforward and require simple storage. However, age differences are observed in complicated tasks that require manipulation of information. If you are, if you are doing a working memory task, say for example the n back task, you have to remember something that came on 2 trials back, or 4 trials back, or 6 trials back. Young and older adults perform similarly on simpler tasks like digit span tasks, where you just have to recall the numbers in serial order. But age difference are substantial on a working memory task where they have to keep some distractors away or perform 2 tasks simultaneously, task switching kind of scenarios. Another example, Stein and colleagues tested people's recall for spoken English, and there were 2 conditions. In one condition, the sentences were spoken in the correct order, normal syntax, and at normal rate of speech. Here the performance of adults and elderly people and young adults was the same, but when when the syntax was jumbled, the words were in jumbled order and they were being spoken at a faster rate, the young adults performed much better than the elderly individuals. So you can see that if as the task gets more complex, there is where you can start seeing the difficulties in memory. Talking about long-term memory in elderly people. So long-term memory basically includes a few things. It includes semantic memory, how they are going to use memory, etc. One of the aspects of long-term memory is prospective memory, that is remembering to do something in the future. Lists, to-do lists, go and do this and come back, and these kind of things. Older individuals generally have difficulty on many prospective memory tasks. For example, in a task where individuals were asked, required to memorize a shopping list, something that they would have to buy from marketplace later, younger adults completed a greater number of tasks than the older adults. Implicit memory. Implicit memory basically involves where there is no explicit recall required, but you have to do a task that involves memory of the previously learned information. Now, Light and colleagues measured implicit memory in terms of the time that the participant required to read a letter sequence that was either familiar or unfamiliar. If they could read the letter sequence fast, it kind of indicated memory. So, basically when they did this task, adults between the ages of 64 to 78, they performed relatively well as the younger adults who were between the ages of 18 to 24. On other research as well, implicit memory shows either similar performances by adults and elder adults and younger adults, or else just a slight deficit for the older adults. So, in tasks of implicit memory, you see that there is almost no difference between how elderly people perform and how young people perform. Explicit recognition memory. A number of research findings have converged on the fact that long-term recognition memory, where explicit recognition is required, either declines slowly or not at all as people are growing older. So, 2 kinds of things are possible. In one of the studies they did, a recognition memory task, they found that 20-year-olds correctly recognize around 67% of the words that had been presented earlier, but that 70% of the 70-year-olds recalled around 66% of the words. So, there is almost no decline here. But if you talk about, this one was about explicit recognition memory. Okay, this one is about explicit recall memory. Now, explicit recall memory basically shows a lot of age differences. They are very marked age differences. In a study by Dunlosky and Herzog, when participants were asked to recall pairs of unrelated English words, 20-year-old participants recalled an average of 20% more than the 70-year-old participants. However, elderly individuals also differed widely in their performance on long-term recall tasks. For example, people who would have low verbal ability and little education are especially likely to show a decline, but people who have decent education and they are having good verbal ability, they can basically show minimal age differences. They kind of perform at par with the younger adult individuals. That was something I was saying in the beginning of the class. Explanations, why are these age differences being observed? Let us talk a little bit about what could be the cause of these age differences between young adults and older people. Research in cognitive neuroscience demonstrates that there are changes in brain structure happening during normal aging. These changes in the brain structure, and these includes areas in the frontal and parietal regions of the cortex and very many subcortical structures. As these parts work together in a coordinated fashion, and say for example, if one of the part is getting slightly tired or damaged, let us say, explicit recall memory can be severely disrupted even if one of these components is not really functioning properly. The pattern of changes in memory performance during normal aging can therefore be explained using a few strategies. Let us see what are the strategies. First is that elderly people report starting to having trouble paying attention. Elderly people often comment that they have more difficulty concentrating on a task nowadays or paying attention. In fact, when elderly adults work on a standard memory task, they perform about the same as when young adults work on a task which requires divided attention. So, it kind of tells you that in the elder people's attentional resources are almost half of the attentional resources of the younger adults. Ineffective use of memory strategies. I was referring to using memory strategies to to boost your memory performance earlier. Now, elderly people could basically have impaired memory because they kind of use memory use memory strategies and meta memory less effectively. I'll kind of talk about meta memory in more detail in just a bit. Research suggests that elderly adults, they construct fewer chunks in working memory as compared to older adults. This could be just one corroborating evidence of the fact that they are not really using memory strategies properly. There is another hypothesis, the contextual cues hypothesis. Elderly people perform relatively well on recognition tasks because contextual cues are present on the recognition tasks itself. In contrast, contextual cues are absent on explicit recall tasks which require people to use effortful and deliberate processing. Younger adults are relatively skilled in remembering contextual cues such as where they were and what date it was, what were they doing when they heard a particular news item, but older people, elder individuals might have a problem with invoking these contextual cues, and hence they would end up performing slightly poorly on these kinds of memory tasks. Finally, you could refer to cognitive slowing. Elderly people often experience cognitive slowing or a slower rate of responding to cognitive tasks. So, this could just be a response thing which is basically reflecting in their performance on these kind of tasks. Now, in summary, we do have several hypotheses that explain some portion of the memory differences that happen between younger and older adults. Now, I was referring to something like meta memory a bit ago. This is the time to start talking a little bit in more detail about this. Now, there are two aspects of metacognition, meta memory and meta comprehension. Meta memory is basically realizing that you need to organize this information in a particular way so that you remember it later. You need to use a particular strategy so that you remember this information better. Meta comprehension is having that sense of whether I have understood this well or I have not understood this well. These are two abilities. I will limit the discussion in today's class up to only meta memory. Now, let us talk a little bit about children's meta memory. Meta memory would include how they understand that how memory works. So, children do have a sense of the fact that a small set of material or small set of pictures, objects can be remembered better than a larger set. Though children often also have unsophisticated ideas about how their memories might be working. For example, 7-year-olds are not yet aware that words are easily remembered if they are associated to each other as compared to whether they are randomly selected or not. Also, younger children are not really aware of how to plan an effective study strategy so that they could remember information better. Another meta memory aspect is the awareness of the fact that effort is necessary. This is a very important component because unless you realize that I should put some effort to remember this information later, you are not going to put that effort and you are not going to retain that information for later. However, young children do not appreciate the principle. They are much more likely than adults to keep studying information that they already know and to not put time properly and put proper strategy basically to remember something that they have not yet learned. They are also not correct in judging whether or not they have successfully memorized material unless you give them a test and you kind of explicitly tell them that you've scored 20% out of 100% on this task. They will not really appreciate that I have not learned this material. Another interesting aspect about meta memory is the judgment about their own memory performance. In general, younger children are often unrealistically optimistic. You ask them how was the test, they would say very good. You ask them how much do you remember, they would say everything, and then you give them questions, they will not really be able to answer everything. When they assess their own memory, so younger children are unrealistically optimistic when they assess their own memory performance, but then older children are slightly more accurate. They are getting better in making these estimations. As children grow up, they become less confident about the answers that might be incorrect. Though it has been demonstrated that even college students are also typically always overestimating the total number of correct answers that they had supplied on a memory test. This is just a graph from a Rubers and colleagues study from 2004, borrowed from Matlin's book. And you can see that 5 years and 5 to 6 year old and 9 to 10 year old, the amount of confidence that they report on questions that they had answered incorrectly is kind of decreasing gradually. So it kind of just corroborates what I was saying. Now, is there a relationship between meta memory and memory performance? It has been suggested that good meta memory links lead, basically good meta memory knowledge or good meta memory skills leads to choice of better memory strategies and might result in better performance on memory tasks. There is evidence that meta memory is related to proper strategy use. For example, children with more sophisticated meta memory skills are more likely to use good memory strategies and to use them effectively. However, the correlation between meta memory and final memory performance has been shown to be moderate. So does not really, having good meta memory skills does not always translate to good performance on the task. You have to do a lot of practice and effort as well. So you can therefore conclude that meta memory is moderately related to memory performance. There is not really a very strong one-to-one link here. Let us talk a little bit about adults' meta memory, elder people's meta memory. They have some kind of beliefs about memory. Older and younger adults, in some sense there is not a difference because they share very similar beliefs about the properties of memory tasks, what is being tested, how do you learn it, the same fundamental knowledge and about how memory works, which strategies may be useful for remembering this material, and what is the material that I can remember better. So there is no real difference between the meta memory skill of belief about memory when you compare younger adults and older adults. Another aspect, monitoring of memory. On some tasks, younger and older adults are equally skilled in monitoring their own memory performance. Older and younger adults are also similar with selecting the most difficult items to remember for further study. So if you have given a material to read to young people and the same material to read for older people, they both will figure out that this part is the most difficult, which I have to rehearse more, spend more effort in remembering for later. The two groups also perform equally well in judging their own performance and judging their own accuracy when kind of answering general knowledge kind of questions and when deciding whether a particular information or particular item is old or new. So they have the almost equal sense of how well they are doing on a task. However, the elder people, the older individuals are slightly more likely to be overconfident on some memory tasks than others. So that's the difference between monitoring capabilities. Other very important aspect is awareness of memory problems. Elderly people, you will see that people always keep telling them that you're getting old, your memory is going to get old, you're not going to, this is eventually has to decline. So they also start believing these things. They are more likely to report problems with everyday memory, especially on explicit recall tasks such as remembering names, phone numbers, so on and so forth. They are also more likely to accept that memory failures have increased over the years. It's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. They start believing that their memory has gone down, even though research evidence does not really suggest the same thing. On the other hand, some elderly people, however, they have this high memory self-efficacy. They are confident, they have that kind of belief in their own potential to perform well on memory tasks. So if you ask them, do you remember that, they will say yes. If you ask them, could you use this information to do that particular task, they would say yes, I have used that, or I am going to use that. So there is this aspect of memory self-efficacy, this confidence on their own potential that they have done well or that they can do well on a given memory task. Now, in summary, if you just again try and summarize the research on meta memory, research on meta memory reveals that elderly adults and young adults are very similar in some respects when meta memory is concerned. So this is all from me about the lifespan developmental approach to memory. We talked about memory and differences of memory between young adults and older adults, infants as well, and then we also talked about metacognition capability as meta memory. Thank you. I think this is the end of the course. We will talk about something more important in the next lecture. Thank you.